Hi, I'm here to tell you a story about farm workers and money. $103 million to start with. $103 million is how much the government paid 14 wealthy landowners for 20,000 acres that they farmed on the shores of Lake Apopka, which is near Orlando, Florida. I want to talk about another figure, throw out another figure of money. 0. That's what the 2,500 workers who had enriched those 14 landowners received. Nothing other than eviction notices telling them to clear out of the trailers that they lived on their employer's land. These weren't migrant workers. Those are the only homes these people had known. Actually, that's not entirely true. The Lake Apopka workers did come away from the farms with something. Cancer, emphysema, recurrent skin rashes, miscarriages, deformed children. For 5 decades, the workers of Apopka were exposed to a witch's brew of pesticides. They breathed them in. They handled plants that were soaked with them. They drank water that was contaminated with them. What happened on the shores of Lake Apopka is a story about an environmental and human tragedy, and who profited from it, and who paid for it. It's also a disturbing look at exactly how little we appreciate the people that pick the food we eat. In the first half of the 20th century, Lake Apopka was renowned for its crystal clear waters. They teemed with trophy largemouth bass. More than a dozen fishing lodges sprang up on its shores. The lake also supported a vibrant commercial catfish fishery. What it didn't support was agriculture. Early attempts to farm it failed. The soil there, called muck, was simply too, well, as you can imagine, mucky. It was rich, but you couldn't grow crops there. Early agricultural experts who came wrote it off as, quote, worthless bottomland and snake-infested swamp. That changed suddenly in 1941. In order to ramp up vegetable production as part of the Second World War effort, the Florida government gave land and adjacent shallow areas of lake bottom to about a dozen local farmers. Not only gave them the land, but then went one step further and paid for a series of dikes and ditches to drain the land. The worthless swampland became some of the most productive agricultural land in the country. Farmers could get 3 successive crops of vegetables off a single field in a year. The worthless muck of Lake Apopka produced bumper harvests of more than 50 types of fruits and vegetables. Within a few years after being reclaimed, the land was valued at $150 an acre, 0 to 150. But not much of it sold, because farming it was simply too profitable for the wealthy landowners. The African Americans that worked on it, not so much. They were paid on a piece basis, a below minimum wage level. One woman I talked to recalled that as recently as the 1980s, she received 12 cents for a 25-pound box of corn, 14 cents for a 25-pound box of greens. And then she had to turn around and pay much of that money right back to her boss to rent a trailer. In addition to great land and really cheap labor, Apopka had another advantage for the corporate farmers on its shores. During dry periods, they could pump water from the lake to irrigate their fields. During wet periods, they could dry the fields by pumping water back out of the fields into the lake. And during fallow times, they simply opened the sluice gates and flooded everything to kill pests and weeds. But every time that water flowed from field to lake, it carried a toxic payload of pesticides and chemical fertilizers. By 1947, only 6 years after farming began, the lake had turned pea soup green. The largemouth bass were extinct. Fishing lodges closed. Commercial fishing gone. By 1980, Lake Apopka had the dubious distinction of being Florida's most polluted lake, and that created a problem for politicians. They could ignore a couple of thousand impoverished African-American farm workers, but Lake Apopka flows into the St. Johns River. The St. Johns River provides drinking water for 4.5 million Floridians, and that's a lot of votes. But when the politicians told the Apopka landowners to stop polluting, the landowners told them, hell no, and then went on to successfully beat the state in court. Because it turns out those initial wartime deals gave the growers complete control over anything that was discharged into the lake or drained out of the lake. They were a law unto themselves. So, stymied, the federal and state government decided they had to buy out the lawyers. That's the only way to clean the place, or the farmers. That's the only way to clean the place up. So they did. They paid that $103 million for the land and equipment. That comes out to $5,400 an acre for land that the minute it was sold to the government, to you and I, once again became worthless. You couldn't farm on it. You couldn't put houses up on it. In one particularly sweet deal, a landowner sold the government a vegetable cooling unit for $1.4 million, and then turned right around and bought it again at auction for $35,000. The workers, they were simply fired. With no more crops to tend, they weren't worth a thing. I first saw Lake Apopka a couple of years ago when I was researching the effects of pesticides on Florida farm workers for my book, Tomatoland. A former farm worker in her late 50s named Linda Lee had offered to take me on what she ominously called the pesticide tour. It was really eerie. It was a beautiful, sunny day. This huge 50-square-mile lake was in front of me. In a metropolitan area of 2 million people, there wasn't a soul on the lake. Linda Lee and I walked across the dusty parking lot. On the edge, there were signs warning us not to stray into the scrubby brush that had sprung up on the former fields. The land that Linda Lee had worked on was still dangerously contaminated a dozen years after the farms had closed. Leaning heavily on a cane because her legs are shot, her hips are shot from stoop labor, Linda Lee chronicled her medical problems. She has lupus, she has arthritis, she has emphysema. She had to have her kidneys failed, they had to be removed, and she got a transplant. Her gallbladder was taken out. She told me, she said, it's painful to get up in the morning and try to get from one day to the next. And Linda numbers herself among the fortunate of Immokalee workers. One of her friends, Geraldine, whose mother worked in the field, still has to take care of her brother, whose arms are badly deformed. On top of that, she has 6 children, 3 of them with lupus, 1 of them had a stroke at age 3 and is crippled, and 1 has cancer. A study done in 2006 showed that 3/4 of Apopka workers report such symptoms. The state has given them no aid. Wasn't for lack of money. $50 million at the urging of land developers has been spent who want to sell some lots on the part of the lake that wasn't farmed, $50 million has been spent to try to clean it up, to no avail. $2 million was spent to find what had killed off a bunch of birds in the lake. It was pesticide poisoning, no surprise there. Another $100,000 or so went to discover why the alligators in the lake were suffering reproductive problems. Stunted penises, if you need to know, due to hormonal imbalances from pesticides again. But there was no money spent, no money earmarked, to find out what had happened to the workers, what was making them sick, until this spring. Finally, the legislature passed a bill providing $500,000 for a little clinic. But when that bill reached the desk of Governor Rick Scott, who in private life had made over $200 million in personal fortune running a private medical company that was later charged with $1 billion fraud, he vetoed it. So here's the tally. Here's the money trail in Lake Apopka. The wealthy farmers that ruined the lake got paid $103 million. Speculators stand to gain from $50 million. Birds and poorly endowed alligators got a couple of $1 million. The workers, not a nickel. All they have is the hope that the bill will someday be reintroduced and perhaps land on the desk of a more sympathetic governor. But maybe we're being too hard on Governor Scott. How can we expect our elected politicians to put more value on farm workers than the people who elected them to office do? And the people who elect them to office, that's us. Thank you.